hole in my bucket. Dear Liza, there's a hole in my bucket. Dear Liza, a hole.
Well, mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, mend it, dear Henry, mend it.
With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, with what shall I mend it, dear Liza, what with?
With straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry, with straw, dear Henry, with straw.
But the straw is too long, dear Liza, the straw is too long, dear Liza, too long.
Well, cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, cut it, dear Henry, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what shall I cut it, dear Liza, with what?
An axe, dear Henry, with an axe, dear Henry, an axe.
The axe is too dull, dear Liza, the axe is too dull, dear Liza, too dull.
Well, sharpen it, dear Henry, well, sharpen it, dear Henry, sharpen it.
With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, with what?
With a stone, dear Henry, with a stone, dear Henry, a stone.
The stone is too dry, dear Liza, the stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry.
Well, wet it, dear Henry, well, wet it, dear Henry, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, with what shall I wet it, dear Liza, with what?
Try water, dear Henry, try water, dear Henry, water.
With what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, with what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, with what?
In a bucket, dear Henry, in a bucket, dear Henry, bucket.
There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza,